I'd been camping many times before, and every trip had always been something I looked forward to. The fresh air, the feeling of getting away from the rush of daily life, the sound of nature surrounding me. It was something I could never get enough of. I had been planning this trip for weeks, and I was finally out in the wild, alone, just the way I liked it. I set up camp by a small, quiet lake in the woods, miles from any town, far enough that I couldn't hear anything except the birds and the breeze. It was perfect. The trees towered above me, their leaves rustling softly in the wind, and the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the water. Everything felt so peaceful, so serene. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and got comfortable. I had a few cans of soup, some snacks, and a couple of books to read. It was just me and the wilderness, and I was happy to be away from everything. There was something about being in nature, disconnected from the noise of the world, that brought me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. The evening passed without incident. I ate, read a little, and watched the stars slowly fill the sky. It wasn't until the middle of the night that things started to feel different. I woke up suddenly, my eyes snapping open in the dark. At first, I thought I just had a bad dream, but then I realized I was wide awake. There was a chill in the air, and the wind had died down completely. Everything was so still, too still, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the silence of the woods playing tricks on me. I lay back down, tried to close my eyes, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I started to drift off, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something out there. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing. No animals, no rustling leaves, nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it around my tent. Nothing. I even unzipped the tent flap just a little, poking my head out, trying to get a better sense of what was going on. The campfire had burned down to a few smoldering embers, casting faint shadows, but there was no one around. I was starting to feel like a fool. There was nothing out there, I told myself. Just the dark, quiet woods, like always. But then I heard it. A twig snapped just outside my tent. My heart raced. I froze. I listened again. Another snap, followed by what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the brush. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. Whoever it was, they were walking on two legs. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was another camper, someone who'd gotten lost in the dark. I thought about calling out, but then I realized I had no idea who it could be. I was miles from the nearest campground. No one should have been out here. The footsteps stopped suddenly. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, straining to hear anything else. There was nothing, just the complete silence again. I waited, my nerves on edge, my flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. I felt like a complete idiot. I was starting to think maybe I was just hearing things, or that I was being paranoid. But then the footsteps started again. They were closer this time, so close I could almost hear the person's breathing. And then there was a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. It sounded like it was coming from right outside my tent. I wasn't about to stay in there anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, just in case, and zipped up the tent. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I wasn't about to just sit there and wait for whoever or whatever it was to get any closer. I slipped out the back of the tent, staying low to the ground. The moonlight cast long shadows across the camp, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the trees. A figure, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let fear control me. I started to slowly move away from the camp, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. What was going on? Who was out here with me? I found a small hill behind my camp and crouched down behind a large rock. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but I could have sworn I heard someone moving around near the camp, just beyond my sight. And then I heard something else, a low growl. It was coming from somewhere in the woods, deeper than where I was. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else, but the sound was unmistakable. I knew that growl. It was a predator, a large one. I pressed myself against the rock, trying to keep as still as possible. My mind was racing again. I'd been in these woods before, and I knew there were bears and wolves in the area. But this growl didn't sound like a bear. It was something deeper, more menacing, something that didn't belong. Then I heard another sound, human footsteps, but they weren't alone. They were accompanied by the crunching of leaves and the rustling of branches, as if someone was moving through the woods with something heavy. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing: I had to get out of there. I didn't care if I had to leave everything behind. I wasn't sticking around to find out what was going on. I stayed hidden, watching the camp from a distance, waiting for the right moment to move. But the night stretched on, and no one seemed to move. The growls grew fainter, and the footsteps seemed to stop. Still, I didn't feel safe enough to return to the camp. Eventually, I realized that I had to make a choice. I could wait until daylight, but that could take forever, and I didn't know what was lurking in the dark. Or I could try to get back to my car, which was at least a mile away from where I had set up camp. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't think I had many other options. I slowly made my way through the woods, moving as quietly as possible. Every step felt like it might be my last. But as I made my way through the underbrush, I noticed something strange. The path I was taking seemed to have been cleared. The branches that should have been in the way had been moved. The ground was unnaturally smooth, as if someone had been walking there recently. I stopped dead in my tracks. I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain why, but I felt a deep sense of dread wash over me. There was something off about the whole situation. Whoever was out here had been moving deliberately, and they knew these woods far too well. I had no idea if they were following me, but I wasn't taking any chances. I continued on, faster now, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for me. I wasn't sure if it was just the fear playing tricks on me, but every time I turned a corner or crept past a thicket, I felt like I was being watched. Eventually, I saw the flicker of headlights in the distance. I had made it. I reached my car and I didn't look back. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was safely in a town, miles away from that dark, quiet forest. I never went back to that campsite. I don't know who or what was out there, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that it was something far more dangerous than a wild animal. Whatever it was, it knew I was there, and it wasn't going to let me leave easily. But I survived, and that's the only thing that matters. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me, my gear, and the great outdoors. The plan was simple: hike out to a remote spot, pitch my tent, and spend 2 days alone in nature, away from the noise of the city. I had done this countless times before, always coming back with a sense of peace and satisfaction. But this time, something felt different. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted to challenge myself, no more easy trails. I picked a location deep in the wilderness, far from any campsites or marked paths. No cell service, no distractions. Just the forest, the mountains, and me. The first few hours of the hike were easy, the well-worn trail guiding me through the trees. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. Everything was exactly how I had imagined it. The further I went, the quieter it became. There was a heavy stillness in the air. It was the kind of silence that felt a little too deep, the kind that makes you realize just how alone you are. But I didn't mind. I liked being alone, away from the rush of everyday life. As I walked, the trail grew more rugged, the ground uneven beneath my boots. I had to slow my pace, navigating the rocks and tree roots that seemed to appear out of nowhere. By mid-afternoon, I reached my destination, a small clearing surrounded by tall, thick trees. It was perfect. The ground was soft with moss, and there was a small stream nearby, its gentle flow providing a soothing background sound. I set up my tent, unfurled my sleeping bag, and then started a small fire. There was a feeling of satisfaction in setting up camp, in knowing that I was completely self-sufficient, relying on nothing but what I had brought with me. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the forest seemed to change. The warm light of the day disappeared, leaving behind the cool, shadowy embrace of night. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves. The sounds of the forest at night were different from the ones during the day, sharper, more distinct. I had planned to go to sleep early, but as the fire burned low, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a strange sense of unease that crept up on me slowly. I shook it off, thinking it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. It wasn't like I was in any real danger. There were no animals here that posed any threat to me, or so I thought. I lay down in my tent, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. The night air was chilly, and the soft rustling of the wind outside the tent seemed louder than it should have been. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Every little sound made me tense up, my mind racing with thoughts that I couldn't shake. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I heard it, a low, distant thud. It was quiet at first, almost like a heartbeat, but it kept getting louder, more persistent. It was coming from the woods, somewhere to my right. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the sound of a falling tree or maybe a rock rolling down a slope, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The thud was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I lay there in the darkness, straining to listen. It wasn't like the typical sounds of wildlife that I was used to. There were no owls hooting, no branches snapping as animals moved through the woods. It was just that thud, over and over again, growing louder and closer. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. My mind was spinning. What could it be? A bear? A deer? But no, it didn't make sense. Those animals didn't make that kind of noise. This was something different. I debated whether or not to go outside and check. On one hand, I didn't want to face whatever it was alone in the dark. On the other hand, if I didn't check, I'd never be able to sleep again. Finally, I decided to grab my flashlight and take a look. My hands shook as I unzipped the tent, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. I stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I didn't see anything. The trees loomed like silent giants, the only movement coming from the breeze that rustled the leaves. I took a few tentative steps toward the source of the sound, and then I saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some branch or rock that had been cast in a strange shape. But no, it was too distinct, too real. The figure was tall, its outline shifting in the dim light. It didn't seem to move, but the thudding sound continued, rhythmic, like a pulse. My stomach dropped, my flashlight flickered, the beam wavering, and then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something shifting in the underbrush. I took another step forward, the beam of light focusing more on the figure. It was then that I realized what it was. Something human-shaped, but it wasn't human. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long, and its face. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could tell something was wrong with it. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was this? I couldn't bring myself to look away, even though every part of me screamed to run. My heart pounded in my chest. For a moment, the world around me felt like it was closing in. The air was thick, and I felt like I was suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The thudding stopped, and all that remained was the sound of the wind rustling the trees. I stood there, frozen. My breath came in shallow gasps. My mind couldn't process what had just happened. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. Eventually, I made myself turn and retreat back into the tent, my flashlight still trembling in my hand. I zipped the tent up and lay there, my heart racing. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't do anything but lie there, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unease and fear. I didn't sleep a wink, my mind replaying that moment over and over again. When morning finally came, I couldn't get out of the tent fast enough. I packed up my things in a hurry, trying to keep my composure as I moved quickly, but every sound made me jump. I didn't look back as I left the clearing. The forest was silent again, just like it had been when I first arrived. The thudding was gone, the strange figure vanished, but I knew something had changed. Whatever it was that I had seen or thought I had seen, it was real and it had been watching me. As I hiked back down the trail, the weight of the experience began to sink in. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't coming back to that spot ever again. I had always loved camping. The peace, the quiet, the way the trees seemed to whisper their secrets in the wind. The smell of fresh pine and the crisp air that hit your lungs the moment you stepped into the forest. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It wasn't some ghost or supernatural force, no. It was something far more terrifying. The kind of danger you don't expect when you're just out there to enjoy the simplicity of nature. I had decided to go camping alone, a weekend getaway just to clear my mind. I was staying at a secluded campsite in the middle of the woods, about an hour's hike from the nearest road. The kind of place where you can't hear cars or see anyone for miles around. It's peaceful, beautiful even, but I didn't realize how much danger could be hidden in something so calm. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent, built a fire, and spent the afternoon walking along the trail that looped through the forest. It was a well-maintained path, marked with small signs here and there, pointing to different landmarks or nearby streams. The sun was still high when I decided to take a short walk into the woods just past the designated trail. Figured, why not? It was still light out, and the woods were calling to me in a way I couldn't resist. I hadn't been walking for long when I came across an area that was different from the rest of the forest. The trees were spaced farther apart, and the ground was soft and spongy underfoot. I walked a little further in, the feeling of being alone starting to settle over me. It wasn't the usual peaceful kind of solitude. It was unsettling. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. It wasn't just the trees. The shadows were growing longer, darker, and it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling off. It was just a little too quiet, that's all. After a while, I realized I had wandered pretty far off the path. I had no idea where I was, and I had left my map back at camp. My phone had no signal, typical for a place so remote. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trees were too similar, the ground too soft, the rocks too smooth. I couldn't even hear the faint rustling of wildlife anymore. The whole world had gone silent. As the light started to fade, panic began to set in. I had to get back to camp before dark. The thought of being out there in the dark, alone, sent a chill down my spine. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself I'd find my way back. After all, it wasn't a huge forest and I wasn't that far off the trail, right? But then I heard it. A crack, a branch snapping in the distance. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. Nothing like the gentle sway of leaves in the wind or the rustling of small animals. This was deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the woods, taking slow, careful steps. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen for any other sounds, but the silence was deafening. The forest felt like it was holding its breath again. I stood there for what seemed like forever, waiting for another sound, anything to tell me what was happening. Then I heard it again, a branch snapping, followed by something that sounded almost like footsteps. But these weren't the kind of footsteps you'd expect to hear on a dirt trail. They were heavier, more deliberate, like someone was walking through the underbrush, stepping over twigs and crunching leaves underfoot. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned around and started running. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I was afraid if I did, I'd see something I wouldn't be able to unsee. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was just my imagination, right? But the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to be getting closer. Every time I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I'd hear another snap of a branch, another crunch of leaves underfoot. The forest was dark now, the trees casting long, ominous shadows on the ground. I couldn't remember which way I had come. Everything looked the same. The path I had been following had disappeared, swallowed up by the endless maze of trees and underbrush. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I had the distinct impression that whatever was out there was gaining on me. I had to find a way out. I kept running, pushing myself harder, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face and the roots that seemed to appear out of nowhere, threatening to trip me. My legs were burning, and my breath was coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. I had to get back to camp. I had to make it back to safety. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw it, the faint glow of my campfire through the trees. It wasn't much, just a small flickering light, but it was enough to make me push harder, to focus everything on that tiny beacon of hope. I ran towards it, my feet pounding against the ground, the footsteps behind me still echoing in the distance. The campfire grew brighter as I got closer, and I almost cried out in relief when I finally broke through the trees and into the clearing where my tent stood. I collapsed next to the fire, my heart racing, my body shaking with adrenaline. I looked around, expecting to see someone or something emerge from the darkness, but the forest was still. The air felt heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't name, but there was no one there, no sign of the footsteps that had followed me. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, my mind racing. Had it all been in my head, or was there something out there, something watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to find out. The next morning, I packed up my gear and left. The sun was up, the forest was quiet, and everything looked normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't stay to find out. As I walked back to the main trail, I found something I hadn't seen before. A set of footprints, fresh in the dirt, leading in the direction I had just come from. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, but I didn't stop to look any closer. I just kept walking, my feet moving faster with every step, until the sound of the forest was drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Maybe they wouldn't believe me. Maybe it wasn't important. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that campsite again. I'd been planning this camping trip for months. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, my gear, and the forest. Nothing special. I had everything packed. My tent, sleeping bag, food, a good book, and my favorite flashlight. The kind of trip I'd taken many times before. I'd camped alone plenty of times, enjoying the solitude and the quiet of the woods. But this time, something felt off from the start. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the treetops. The air had a chill to it, but nothing that would keep me from setting up camp. I chose a secluded spot near a creek, the soft murmur of water just enough to drown out any distant sounds of the highway. I pitched my tent and got a fire going. The crackling of the flames was comforting, like an old friend. I sat back in my camp chair, watching the firelight dance on the trees. But then, I noticed something. There was a rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a squirrel, but the sound wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the bushes. Nothing. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination. There was no one out here, no reason for anyone to be near my camp. I took a deep breath and settled back into my chair, trying to relax. The evening passed quietly. I ate my dinner, just some freeze-dried pasta, and then crawled into my tent as the night air grew colder. I zipped myself in, lying on my back and staring at the mesh ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind rustled the leaves, and the creek babbled on in the distance. I felt safe, maybe too safe. My mind kept drifting back to that strange rustling sound. Around midnight, I was woken up by a noise, a thump, then another. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The sounds were coming from outside the tent. Heavy steps. Whoever or whatever it was getting closer. My flashlight was just out of reach, and I didn't want to make any noise. The last thing I wanted was to alert whoever it was to my presence. I could hear breathing now, slow and steady, like someone was waiting, just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen. I couldn't move. I had no idea what to do. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Could it be another camper? A hunter? But why hadn't they called out? Why hadn't they made their presence known? The breathing stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I listened intently, straining to hear even the slightest noise. Nothing. Slowly, I exhaled, the tension in my body starting to ease. Maybe it was a bear or just an animal passing by. That was the most likely explanation. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and slowly unzipped the tent. There was nothing there. The campsite looked exactly the same as it had earlier. Empty, quiet, untouched. I stepped outside, scanning the area with my flashlight. The light flickered as I moved it from side to side, but I didn't see anything unusual.
No footprints.
No signs of disturbance, just the quiet of the forest. But I still felt like I wasn't alone. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I told myself that I was overreacting. There had to be a rational explanation. I stood there for a moment longer, then decided to retreat back into my tent. I'd leave in the morning. That's when I heard it again. An unmistakable sound, closer this time. A heavy thud. Something had stepped on a branch just outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? There was no cell signal out here. I wasn't gonna risk leaving my tent and running into whatever was out there. I lay back down, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. The next few hours passed in a tense silence. Every tiny sound, every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig had me on edge. By dawn, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to get out of there. My gut told me that whatever was lurking near my campsite wasn't gonna just go away. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my bag. I didn't even bother with the fire. I wanted to be gone as fast as possible. I started walking back toward my car, staying on the path the whole way. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack in the leaves, had me looking over my shoulder. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get out. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, as if the forest itself was holding me there. When I finally reached the parking area, I couldn't believe I'd made it. I threw my gear in the car and slammed the door shut. As I started the engine, I looked back toward the trail I had just walked. There, standing just at the tree line, was a figure. Tall, thin, and shadowed by the trees. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I drove away, my heart still pounding, my mind racing. What had that been? Who was out there? What did they want? I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that campsite. Ever. I had always loved camping. There's something about the peace of the woods, the fresh air, and the quiet hum of nature that calms the mind. It was the perfect escape from the noise of city life. So, when I got the chance to spend a few days in the wilderness, I jumped at the opportunity. I had a week off from work, and I had been planning this trip for a while. A solo camping adventure deep in the heart of the forest, miles away from any roads or people. Just me, my tent, and the woods. I drove for hours, the landscape slowly changing from the hustle of the city to the calm, sweeping hills of rural countryside. My destination was a spot I had heard about from some fellow campers online. They spoke of it like it was a hidden gem, a place where few ventured. It was exactly what I was looking for: quiet, secluded, and raw. The dirt road I was following grew smaller and more winding as I neared my campsite. The trees grew thicker around me, towering high above. I rolled down my window, letting the cool breeze in, and could hear the distant call of birds and the rustling of the wind through the leaves. The scent of pine filled the air. Everything felt perfect. I parked my car near the edge of a clearing and began to unload my gear. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I knew I had to set up camp quickly. The last thing I wanted was to be fumbling with a tent in the dark. The clearing was quiet, too quiet. Usually, I would hear the sound of animals or insects, but here, there was nothing. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook off the feeling and kept going, setting up my tent and getting a fire going. As the fire crackled, I sat back and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. The woods around me were still, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I had my dinner and then sat by the fire, staring into the flames. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft crunching noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting the branches around. But then it came again, a deliberate crunch, like something was walking toward me. I tensed up, my heart beating faster. I glanced around, but there was no movement in the trees, no animal in sight. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Yet the sound persisted. It was as if something was walking just beyond the reach of the light, too far to see but close enough to hear. My mind raced. I had been camping for years, and I'd never felt so on edge. The thought that maybe a bear or some other animal was nearby crossed my mind, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't the steady rhythm of a large creature's footsteps. It was erratic, like something uncertain, moving in fits and starts. I sat there, frozen, trying to listen more closely. The noise stopped for a few moments, only to start again. This time, louder, like it was circling me. The hairs on my arms stood up as I felt a chill creep down my spine. I stood up and took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the firelight, shining my flashlight in all directions. Nothing. The crunching sound had stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. It lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I scanned the trees again, but there was still no sign of anything. I thought maybe it was a deer, or maybe even a smaller animal that was just trying to avoid me. But that didn't explain the weird feeling in my gut. I decided to call it a night. There was no reason to keep worrying about something that might just be my imagination. I extinguished the fire and climbed into my tent, zippered it up tightly, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing that sound in my mind, that faint crunching noise. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something moving just outside my tent, watching me. The night dragged on in restless silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep, only to wake up with a start a few hours later. It was pitch black outside, and I could hear the wind picking up again. But this time there was something else, a low, distant sound that I couldn't quite place. It was almost like a soft whisper, but not in any language I could understand. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening intently. The whispering continued for a few moments, growing louder. It sounded as though it was coming from the trees around me, from the very depths of the forest. The hair on the back of my neck stood up again. Something wasn't right. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the sound stopped abruptly. Everything went silent, and the air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. I could feel the tension building, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I told myself it was just the wind, just my nerves. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, opened the zipper, and stepped outside, shining the light into the darkness. The clearing was empty, still and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the trees again, but everything looked normal. I stood there for a long moment, trying to calm myself, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe it was just the isolation, the strange noises of the night playing tricks on me. But that didn't explain the whispers, or the fact that the crunching sound had returned, much louder than before. It was now unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I made a snap decision. I needed to leave. I wasn't going to stick around any longer, not with the way things were feeling. I hurriedly packed my things, not bothering to make everything perfect. I just wanted out. As I was about to leave, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand. The light caught on something moving in the trees, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was too dark, too far to see clearly. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my bag and started running toward my car. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees growing darker, their branches swaying as if they were reaching for me. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was getting to the car and driving away as fast as I could. When I finally made it to the clearing where I had parked, my heart was still racing. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and slammed the door shut. As I pulled away from the campsite, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The clearing was empty, nothing but the dark forest behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled over and took a few deep breaths. I had never felt so relieved in my life. There was no explanation for what happened out there, no rational reason for what I had heard or felt. But one thing was for sure, I was never going back to that place. I had always loved camping. There was something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the sound of wind through the leaves, and the crackling of a fire that made me feel at peace. But that peace was shattered one night during a solo camping trip, far away from any trails, deep into a forest I had never ventured into before. I decided to go on this trip alone. I needed to disconnect from everything for a while. No phone, no internet, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I had heard stories about this forest, how it was untouched and wild, but there was something about the challenge that intrigued me. The area was remote, and the nearest town was miles away. I thought that would be perfect, just me and the forest. I drove up the dirt road leading to the trailhead, the sun beginning to dip behind the mountains. The air had a crispness to it, the kind of air you only get in the woods. The trees were tall, the shadows long. I parked my car at the edge of the road and took a deep breath, the smell of pine needles and earth filling my lungs. My heart raced with excitement, and I grabbed my pack, setting out on foot. The trail wasn't well marked. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd find a steady stream of hikers or campers. It was secluded, hidden almost, but that's what I liked about it. I thought I'd be alone with nature, no distractions, just the sound of the wind and the birds. My boots crunched on the gravel and twigs as I walked deeper into the woods. As night began to fall, the forest took on a different tone. The shadows became heavier, the sounds of the forest more pronounced. I wasn't scared, not at first. It was just the usual forest sounds, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I set up camp as it got darker, pitching my tent near a small creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and I lit a small campfire, feeling the warmth as I settled down for the night. The fire crackled, and I could feel myself relaxing. I was tired from the hike, but content. There were no other campers around, and that felt good. I had some simple food, a book to read, and the stars above me. Everything felt perfect, but as the night wore on, something changed. First, it was just a feeling, a creeping sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The sounds of the forest seemed to shift. The rustling of the trees wasn't as natural as it had been before. There was something else in the air, something I couldn't place. My mind started to race. I glanced around the firelight, but everything looked as it should. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, no one, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just nerves, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I sat by the fire for a while longer, my eyes darting to the edge of the camp, where the darkness swallowed everything. Then I heard it, a rustling, but not from the usual wildlife. This was heavier, something or someone moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. The rustling stopped. Silence. I waited, heart pounding in my ears. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was different. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees around me, but saw nothing. Just the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the ground. My mind played tricks on me. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But as I sat there, the silence grew heavier, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Every instinct in my body told me to leave, but I refused to let fear control me. I was a seasoned camper. This was just my mind playing games. I turned my attention back to the fire, trying to focus on the crackling sound, but then I heard it again. This time it was closer, a soft crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately stood up, shining my flashlight toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I felt a chill spread through me, and the unease I had been fighting off for hours finally broke through. My rational mind told me to stay calm, that this was just some animal or maybe another camper who had wandered off the trail. But then I heard it again, a low, almost inaudible whisper of movement in the bushes. It was coming from a different direction now, closer than before. I didn't know what to do. I considered packing up and leaving, but the thought of walking through the dark, deep forest alone made my stomach churn. It was too risky. Instead, I decided to stay put. Couldn't let my fear control me. But as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to focus on the fire again, the warmth, the safety of it, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. The minutes stretched on. I didn't dare get up again. Couldn't. The fire seemed to flicker more erratically, casting strange shadows on the ground. And then it came, a loud snap from behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but again, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the wind rustling through the branches. My mind was racing. Was it an animal? Was someone out there? The quiet became unbearable, the silence like a pressure on my chest. It was as if the whole forest had grown still, holding its breath. And then I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. A soft thud, as if something had just stepped on a branch, came from behind me, right at the edge of the camp. I grabbed my pack, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the straps. I didn't know if I should run or stay, but all I could do was sit there, staring into the dark. The thud came again, closer this time. My pulse hammered in my ears. I finally stood up, grabbing my flashlight and swinging it toward the sound. The beam swept over the trees, the ground, but there was nothing there. That was when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The sounds had stopped, but there was something else. A subtle change in the air. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it. Someone or something was out there, watching me. I tried to calm myself, but the tension in the air was unbearable. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I quickly grabbed my gear and packed everything up. I wasn't staying another minute in that forest, not with the overwhelming sense of being watched. As I packed, the world around me seemed to close in. The shadows felt deeper. The trees seemed to press closer. But then, as quickly as it had started, it was gone. The air cleared. The feeling of being watched faded. The forest returned to its natural rhythm. The sound of the creek rushing, the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves. I didn't question it. I didn't need to. I grabbed my stuff and hurried back to the trail. The moonlight filtered through the trees as I walked, my heart still racing, but the terror had passed. By the time I reached my car, I was almost relieved. The forest was still there, quiet and serene, as if nothing had happened. I drove back to the town, my heart finally beginning to slow. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never return to that forest again. I'd never considered myself the kind of person who would be caught off guard in the wilderness, but that weekend, it all changed. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, a backpack, and the quiet hum of nature. I had planned to spend a couple of days hiking alone, just to clear my head. It had been a rough few months. Work, stress, personal issues, and I needed the solitude to breathe, to think. I drove up to the trailhead early on a Friday morning, the air still crisp with the last hints of a cool autumn. The sun was barely up, casting a soft orange glow over the trees, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. There was a sense of peace, of calm, and for a moment, I let it wash over me. The parking lot was empty, save for a few other cars parked in the back. The trail sign said it was a 10-mile hike to the campsite. Not too hard, but enough to get my blood flowing. I locked my car, double-checked that I had everything: water, food, my tent, and set off down the trail. The path wound through a dense forest of tall pines and oaks, the ground soft beneath my boots, with fallen leaves crunching underfoot. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the occasional call of a bird or the distant rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. It was just a normal day in the woods. Still, the quiet felt different. It was like I was being swallowed by the forest, every step taking me further from the world I knew. About 3 hours into the hike, the trail started to get steeper. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the ground. I wiped the sweat from my brow and pushed onward. By the time I reached the campsite, I was exhausted, but in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from a good hike. The campsite was tucked away in a small clearing near a creek, a perfect spot with a great view of the surrounding trees. It was isolated enough to feel like a real retreat, but not so remote that I felt completely cut off from everything. I set up my tent and started a small fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound around me, and for a while, I just sat there, letting the fire warm me and watching the smoke curl up into the sky. The night was coming on fast, and the shadows between the trees grew longer. I had brought a book with me but didn't feel like reading. It was too quiet for that, so I just sat, staring into the fire and listening to the silence of the woods. As the evening wore on, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the wind rustling through the leaves, seemed to fade. It wasn't completely silent, but there was a distinct absence of noise that felt unnatural. I brushed it off at first. Maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe I was just being overly sensitive. But then the feeling of being watched crept over me. It wasn't like the usual awareness you get in the woods, where you know there are animals around. This was something else, something subtle but persistent. I got up and stoked the fire, hoping it would chase away the odd feeling. But as the night grew darker, the sensation only got stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest stretching out behind me. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the wind through the trees made my heart race. I kept imagining shadows moving just outside, shapes I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake. The air had changed. It was colder, and the fire outside had long since burned out. I could barely make out the silhouettes of the trees through the thin fabric of the tent. The silence was oppressive, too heavy. Something felt wrong that I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, willing myself to ignore the sensation of something being off. It wasn't until I heard the first noise that I truly felt the shift. A soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was distant at first, but then it came again, closer this time. Thud, thud, like footsteps, deliberate and slow. I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind, no animals, no reason for the sounds. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps weren't in a straight line. They were erratic, almost like whatever was making them was unsure of its path. The sound moved around my campsite, from one side to the other, coming closer and closer. I was frozen in place. My instincts told me to get up, to check outside, but I couldn't move. What if it was an animal? What if it wasn't? My mind raced through the possibilities, but none of them felt right. Then there was a noise I hadn't expected. A whispering sound, like a low murmur carried on the wind. I was certain it hadn't been there before. The footsteps stopped, and the whispering grew louder, though it didn't make any sense. It wasn't a language I could recognize. I thought about reaching for my phone, but then I realized I'd left it in my bag outside. I knew I had to act quickly. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but every instinct told me something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously, poking my head out into the cold night air. The forest was dark, the kind of dark where you couldn't see beyond a few feet in front of you. I swept the light around, my hand trembling slightly. The shadows of the trees stretched long and ominous in the beam of my flashlight, but there was nothing in sight. Nothing except the silence. It was absolute. I stayed outside for a while, listening, but the footsteps and whispering were gone. It was so quiet now that the only sound was the rush of the creek nearby. I had convinced myself it was just my nerves, that maybe I was hearing things after a long day of hiking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Eventually, I crawled back into my tent, though I didn't sleep much after that. Every noise, every little creak of the trees, kept me awake, and the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the woods around me. When I finally made it back to my car, I took one last look at the forest. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, just like when I arrived. But I knew that something had changed. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I wasn't coming back to that trail. Not ever again. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something calming about being surrounded by nature, where the only noise is the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. That's why I decided to go on a solo camping trip last fall. I had planned it out for weeks, picked the perfect location near a small, remote lake, far enough from the city to feel like I was truly away from everything. The hike in was peaceful. The trail was well-worn, winding through a dense forest of tall pines and birches. The ground was soft beneath my boots, with fallen needles and leaves creating a thick carpet that muffled every step. It was a chilly morning, but the sun was strong enough to warm the air as it filtered through the treetops. I felt a sense of contentment as I carried my gear up the path, knowing that in just a few hours, I'd be sitting by the campfire, alone in my little corner of the wilderness. The campsite was ideal, right by the lake with a small clearing surrounded by trees. I set up my tent first, using the sturdy poles to stretch the fabric tight, ensuring it would hold up through the night. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of water lapping at the shore was a welcome addition to the usual forest noises. I unpacked my gear, set up a small stove for cooking, and got a fire going with a few twigs and dry leaves. The day passed slowly, as I sat by the fire, watched the flames dance, and thought about how lucky I was to be out here. There was no rush, no need to hurry anywhere. It was just me and the world around me. I cooked a simple meal, roasted some marshmallows, and even took a short walk around the area to explore. The lake was calm, its surface like glass, reflecting the trees perfectly. It was almost surreal how peaceful everything was. As the evening approached, I felt the temperature dropping, so I built up the fire to stay warm. The sky was starting to darken, and the moon was rising slowly, casting a pale light over the lake. The forest was quieter now. The birds had gone to their nests, and the wind had died down. Perfect night for camping, I thought. I didn't expect any trouble at all, and nothing seemed unusual at first. But as the darkness deepened, I began to feel uncomfortable. It wasn't anything obvious, but there was a strange stillness in the air that I couldn't quite place. The fire crackled, sending up little sparks into the night sky, but the forest around me had grown unnervingly quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the usual eerie sensation that comes with being alone in the woods. I'd been on solo camping trips before, and this was nothing out of the ordinary. I tucked myself into my sleeping bag inside the tent as the fire burned low. The only sounds now were the occasional snap of a burning log and the soft, rhythmic sound of my breathing. I was about to drift off to sleep when I heard something, a twig snapping. It was faint, but unmistakable. I froze, listening. There it was again, this time closer. My heart rate increased, but I stayed still, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the direction of the trees near the edge of the camp. I knew it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the thought didn't ease my nerves. I had heard that when animals were near a camp, they would often be curious and cautious. But the way the sounds came closer made me feel like something or someone was moving deliberately through the forest. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to steady my hand, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in front of me. Nothing, no movement, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My instincts were on edge, urging me to stay alert, even though everything seemed calm. I lay back down, trying to force myself to relax. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I reminded myself that I was a seasoned camper, used to spending time in the woods. There was no reason to be afraid. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a low, drawn-out noise. I sat up in an instant, my heart racing. The noise was distant, but it was a growl or maybe a grunt. It was low, almost like the sound of something large pushing through the underbrush. It didn't sound like any animal I recognized. No bear, no wolf, no deer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body told me that something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight again, this time holding it firmly, my knuckles white from the grip. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, scanning the area around my camp. The fire was down to embers now, casting only faint light, but I saw nothing. No animals, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. Yet that growling sound continued, distant but growing closer. I had to make a decision. I could stay in the tent, hoping whatever was out there would go away. Or I could investigate, but that was risky. My mind raced, but in the end, I decided I needed to know what was going on. I wasn't about to let my fear control me. I wasn't some scared city person who didn't understand the woods. I unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside, flashlight raised, scanning the dark forest. I walked slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, keeping my eyes on every shadow and moving branch. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I felt like something was out there, something that was deliberately trying to stay hidden. The growling noise came again, much closer now, sending a wave of adrenaline through me. It was like a low rumble vibrating the air. I froze, listening closely, and then I saw it. At the edge of the trees, not far from my campsite, there was a large shadow moving, its outline too bulky to be a deer. I aimed the flashlight at it, but the light just seemed to disappear into the blackness. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't see what it was, but I could hear it, close enough now that it sounded like it was right next to me. I began to back away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, louder now, followed by a sound I couldn't identify, like something heavy dragging along the ground. I knew I had to make a choice, stay out here and risk whatever that was coming closer, or get back to the safety of my tent. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs felt like they were moving in slow motion as I sprinted back to my camp. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I scrambled to get back to the tent. I didn't dare look back. I dove into the tent, zipped it up quickly, and threw myself under the sleeping bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting, listening. The growling stopped. The sounds of the forest returned. It was quiet again. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour. I couldn't sleep, too alert, too terrified of whatever was out there. But eventually, my exhaustion took over, and I fell into a deep sleep despite my fear. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was rising, and the forest was alive with the usual sounds. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. I sat up, blinking in the light, and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. The fire from the night before had burned out, and everything around me looked normal, too normal. No signs of anything unusual. No animal tracks, no broken branches, no disturbances. I spent the next few hours packing up, feeling a sense of relief that whatever had happened the night before seemed to have passed. I was ready to leave, not wanting to stay any longer. As I hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me. But nothing ever did. When I reached my car and looked back one last time at the forest, I realized something. I would never fully know what it was that night, but I did know one thing. There's something about being alone in the woods that makes you feel small, makes you realize that nature doesn't care about your comfort or your plans. It's wild, unpredictable, and at times, more frightening than we like to admit. And as I drove away, I promised myself I'd always be cautious on my next camping trip, never taking the peace of the forest for granted again. I remember the first time I went camping alone. It wasn't something I had planned for weeks or dreamed of doing for years. It was something spontaneous, a way to get away from everything. I needed the break. I had spent the past few months buried in work and responsibilities. So when the opportunity arose to get out of the city and into the wilderness, I took it. I packed my gear, grabbed my tent, and headed for the nearest forest. It was supposed to be peaceful, a weekend of solitude. I wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. The drive out was uneventful, just me, the road, and the occasional passing car. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just a quick weekend trip, I figured. It was a small, off-the-beaten-path campground, so it didn't attract a lot of people. The kind of place where you could be alone with nature, away from cell phones and distractions. Just me and the trees. When I arrived, it was already late afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, but it was beginning to dip behind the mountains. I set up my tent near a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. It was a beautiful spot, quiet except for the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I unpacked my gear and started a small fire to cook some dinner. The air was crisp but not too cold, and the evening felt perfect. As the fire crackled, I sat back and thought about how lucky I was to be out there. No emails, no deadlines, just nature. But as the night fell and the sky turned dark, I started to feel a strange unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a subtle discomfort creeping up on me. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I'd camped plenty of times before, but never alone. Felt different, more intense, more silent. I tried to push the feeling away. The fire was warm, and the sound of the crackling wood was comforting. But as the minutes ticked by, that feeling of discomfort grew. It was as if the forest was watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I finished my dinner and sat there, staring into the fire. It was then that I noticed how quiet everything had become. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the calls of distant animals had faded away. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I shrugged it off. Maybe the animals were settling in for the night. Maybe it was just the calm before the storm of nighttime sounds. But then I heard something. It was a faint noise, almost like a whisper on the wind. I couldn't tell if it was coming from nearby or from deeper in the woods. It was low and soft, but there was something unnerving about it. My first instinct was to ignore it, but it kept coming, like a rustling or a movement, but without a clear direction. I stood up, trying to see if I could spot whatever it was, but there was nothing, just the shadows of the trees, stretching long and thin under the dim light of the fire. I decided to go for a short walk. Maybe it was my nerves, or maybe I was just bored, but I needed to stretch my legs. The trail behind the campsite led deep into the forest, and though I hadn't planned on venturing too far, I thought a quick look wouldn't hurt. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and started walking down the narrow path. The trees grew denser the further I went, and the soft rustling noise seemed to follow me, just on the edge of my hearing. Every time I turned my head to look, there was nothing there. No animals, no other campers. Just the steady beat of my own footsteps. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. But it wasn't just the noise that bothered me, it was the stillness, the unnatural silence of the forest around me. No owls calling, no wind rustling through the leaves. It felt off. I walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more. My flashlight illuminated the trail ahead, but it didn't seem to push back the darkness much. It was as if the forest was swallowing the light. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was drifting away from everything familiar. I was alone in the woods, and it was starting to feel like the woods didn't want me there. Eventually, I stopped. My gut told me it was time to head back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wandered too far. I turned around to retrace my steps, but the path I had walked seemed different now. The trees looked unfamiliar, the shadows darker, the air colder. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find some landmark, something to tell me where I was. But there was nothing, just more trees, more darkness. Panic began to set in. I had been walking for an hour or more, and now I had no idea where the trail was. The flashlight beam quivered in my hand as I swung it back and forth. The rustling noise had stopped, but now I felt it in my bones. Something was out there, watching me. I wasn't sure what, but I knew it wasn't a friendly presence. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was just the woods playing tricks on me. I retraced my steps, trying to find any sign of the path. But no matter which way I turned, everything looked the same. The trees were closing in on me, and I was beginning to feel more and more disoriented. The panic in my chest grew as the night deepened. My breath quickened, and my heart pounded. I was lost. I knew I had to stay put and wait for morning, but the thought of spending the night alone in the dark woods was terrifying. I couldn't just sit there. I had to move. I had to find my way back. I walked faster, ignoring the fear gnawing at my insides. I called out, but there was no answer. No one else was around. The sound of my own voice seemed to disappear into the forest. I must have walked for hours, zigzagging through the trees, trying to find the trail or any sign of my campsite. But nothing. Just the endless darkness and the weight of the forest pressing in on me. Finally, exhaustion began to take over. My feet were sore, my head was spinning, and my stomach growled in hunger. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. It was then that I heard something, faint but clear, a sound like footsteps, crunching through the leaves. Not far from me, I froze. The air around me seemed to hold its breath. Was it another hiker, or was it something else? I strained my ears, but the noise stopped. I waited, breath held, but there was nothing. No more footsteps, just silence. That silence, however, was deafening. I had to make a decision. It was getting colder, and I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly. I had no food, no water, and no sense of direction. I had to take action. I decided to try something drastic. I started yelling. I shouted for help, screamed into the night. My voice echoed through the trees. First, there was no response. But then, just when I thought my throat would give out, I heard something, a faint answer, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the distance. I shouted again, and this time there was a clearer reply. A voice, human, I thought, calling back. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't alone. I followed the sound of the voice, stumbling through the forest, barely able to keep my balance. The light of my flashlight flickered as I moved, but I kept going, my mind set on reaching the source of the voice. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A campfire, a real warm fire, and standing near it were two people. They weren't in any hurry to move, but when they saw me approach, they waved me over. They had been camping nearby, they explained, and they had heard my calls. They gave me water and some food. I didn't say much. I was too tired, too overwhelmed to speak. But in that moment, I knew I was safe. I learned the next day that I hadn't been too far from my campsite. But the forest had a way of disorienting me, playing tricks on my mind. I never did figure out what had caused that strange feeling in the air, or the odd noises I had heard, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go camping alone again. The experience was terrifying, but it was also a lesson. Nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but it can also be unpredictable. And sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the animals or the weather. It's getting lost in your own mind. I made it back to my car the next morning, a little shaken but grateful. As I drove away from the forest, I looked back at the trees, feeling a mixture of relief and respect. The wilderness had tested me, and I had passed, but I wasn't in any hurry to return. That night, I had learned the importance of preparation, caution, and listening to the feeling in your gut. And above all, I had learned not to take the wild for granted. Camping had always been my escape. The noise and rush of daily life could be overwhelming, and the idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and the sounds of nature was always a comfort. This time, I had picked a remote campsite deep in the wilderness of northern Vermont. It was a place I had read about online. A hidden gem, they called it, promising solitude and untouched beauty. I'd packed my gear meticulously, ensuring I had everything I needed for a weekend away from civilization. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. My car bumped along a dirt road that seemed to stretch forever into the dense forest. The farther I went, the fewer signs of human life I saw. No houses, no other cars, just the occasional deer darting across the road. When I finally reached the small clearing that served as a parking area, it was completely empty. That was exactly what I wanted. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders and began the hike. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, a clear sign that not many people ventured out here. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, green glow. The air smelled earthy and clean, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. After a couple of hours, I reached the campsite, a flat patch of ground near a small, clear stream. It was idyllic. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I had a small fire crackling, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and leaned back to stare at the stars. There were so many of them, more than I ever saw back home. It felt like I was the only person in the world. The first night passed peacefully. I woke up early, feeling refreshed and eager to explore the area. I spent the day hiking further into the woods, following animal trails and finding hidden clearings. I even stumbled upon a small pond, its surface like a mirror reflecting the sky. I sat there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest and letting my thoughts wander. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was setting again. It was that night when things began to feel off. As I lay in my tent, the forest seemed unusually quiet. The normal nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. My heart started to race. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the random noise of an animal moving through the woods. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over me. I didn't want to unzip the tent and look outside, so I stayed inside, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The footsteps eventually faded away, and after what felt like hours, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the experience. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you when you were alone in the woods. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that lingered as I went about my day. I decided to stay closer to the campsite, venturing only a short distance to gather more firewood and refill my water bottle from the stream. That night, the unease turned into full-blown fear. It started the same way, the eerie silence, followed by the sound of footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop. They circled my campsite, slow and deliberate. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs, moving in a steady rhythm around me. My hands shook as I held my flashlight, pointing it at the tent walls, but I didn't dare go outside. Then, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was light, like the touch of a hand. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think straight. All I could do was sit there, frozen, listening as the footsteps moved away and the forest fell silent again. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and on edge. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the solitude of the wilderness, this was too much. I packed up my gear quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The hike back to the car felt longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the clearing where I had parked, I let out a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. My car was just as I had left it, but something was off. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My heart sank as I approached, and when I looked inside, my worst fears were confirmed. The contents of my glove compartment were scattered across the seats, and my backpack, which I had left in the trunk as a backup, was gone. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Whoever had been stalking me in the woods had been here too. I checked the car carefully, but there was no one around. The keys were still in my pocket, so at least I could still drive. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. The drive home was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Even when I got back to my apartment, the sense of unease lingered. For days, I kept checking my locks and looking over my shoulder. I never found out who or what had been out there with me, and that's what haunts me the most. It wasn't the wilderness that scared me. It was the thought that someone else had been out there, watching me, waiting, and I'll never know why.